For the debate, we're going to have a format where first each contestant, what's the word for people involved in the debate? Each debater, is it that simple?
Yeah.
Each debatant will give 10 minutes, then they'll each have 5 minutes to brutally rebut the opponent's conclusion. So start with our token optimist, Josh Hall.
Hi there, thanks. Yeah, last year, those of you who attended the workshop, I gave a talk, a paper, and Hugo gave a talk, and Ben stood up, and after the two talks, he says, wow, they really seem to have these totally different opinions. So when we were putting the program together this time, we thought it might be even cooler if we made it into a formal debate, which who knows. But my major point, and I call myself a futurist as what I really do in the world. And I've been looking at this sort of thing, AI and nanotechnology and a bunch of other things for quite some time, and studying history as a way of getting a background on the sort of things that you can expect in the future. And my notion of what's really likely to happen coming up is something an awful lot like the Industrial Revolution. And it's just the same sort of thing as one of Robin's phase shifts in growth modes. But a lot of the basic truths remained the same before and after. I mean, people were still people, and I claim that our machines will, in some very strong sense, still be people because they'll be built entirely out of human ideas. And so if we can follow the model of the Industrial Revolution, what happened actually was that after the Industrial Revolution, our lives were much better than they were before. If you compare what it was like to be a medieval serf, they have a life expectancy of something like 30. They ate a really what we would consider poor, bland diet, and one of the reasons they did was that they hardly had any teeth left. They hardly ever traveled more than 5 miles from where they were born, and you know, they probably knew somebody who owned a book. I mean, this is a very limited kind of life that was lived by a subsistence a farmer in the place where all of my ancestors came from, anyway. And yet, after the Industrial Revolution and the succeeding era of growth that came from that, we get to where we are now, and we can fly all over the world and talk about crazy things like AGI and eat remarkably interesting stuff if that's what you like to do. And I happen to believe that if we go through another revolution like that, that the people that will become on the other end of it will look back on us about the same way we would look back on the medieval serf. Okay, 1900, roughly a century ago, was really a hotbed of technological optimism. Okay, the heroes of the day were things like Thomas Edison. They named cities after him. Edison, New Jersey, still there. Edward Bellamy wrote this book, Looking Backwards, that was an immense popular favorite. That there were something like 1,800 societies in the various cities of the United States back around 1900 that were dedicated to advancing the kind of future that Edward Bellamy talked about in Looking Backwards. H.G. Wells was one of the most popular novelists in the world, and he was, at least in those days, a very optimistic, actually socialist, but a very optimistic, forward-looking person who thought that we were going to create a whole new world and with the advances of science. With all of this technological optimism, nobody, writing in 1900, nobody predicted that almost everybody would own an automobile. Okay, that's sort of the things that happen when technology takes off and makes so much more possible than people are used to believing is possible. And there's lots of people who currently look at the automobile and say, you know, what a horrible thing that everybody has automobiles and the roads are crowded and so forth. But the fact is that, that I would claim that everybody having an automobile is a much better world than one in which nobody had an automobile and only the few rich people had cars, and otherwise everybody was dependent on Shanks' mare mostly. And of course most of the commerce happened on railroads and so forth. So that's another historical point to the notion that after a revolution of the kind that we can expect with AGI, the world would be a lot better for people, individual people, to live in. The vast majority of AIs will be human level or lower. I mean, this is just simple economic sense. There's lots and lots and lots of jobs for AIs to do, and the cheaper they are, the more kinds of jobs you can have. In many places in the world, they have a doorman who stands there and opens the door for you, right? Well, you wouldn't think that people would hire an actual human being to do that, but in fact they do. The cheaper the human gets, the cheaper the human-like AI gets, the more likely there'll be a doorman at every door. Okay, that's the sort of thing you're going to find in the future. Stuff that we would just consider absolutely outrageous, conspicuous consumption is going to happen because the human level effort is going to get cheaper and cheaper. And I'm thinking, and I'm talking here about the kinds of things that makes the world safer and cleaner and travel easier and entertainment better that we actually put humans to now. But you can imagine once that a human level AI costs $1, that they'll just be absolutely everywhere. And they will be helping you in ways that you can't imagine being helped before. I mean, just imagine that you were the ruler of the world and the efforts of all 7 billion people were there for nothing but your own personal benefit. If you take the Moore's Law worth of progress out, you'll get not too far, maybe 50 years out after the first AGIs, you'll get to where that much human level effort could be redounding to your own benefit. And if you doubt me, imagine how much it would cost to hire human accountants to do all the arithmetic that is being done for my benefit by this computer right now, which is probably 1 billion multiplications per second or more. Okay. So the thing is that if you can think of any way in which having human intellectual physical effort would help you, that's going to be possible economically after just a few decades of the sort of phase shift in productivity that AGIs are going to make possible. So you're going to be like Bill Gates in this world. Your only job in life will really be deciding what it is you want, which is going to be tough because there's going to be an awful lot of possibilities. The resources available to you will be essentially limitless, and I mean, if you really want to spend all your time, you know, looking over the Ben Goertzel's neighbor scope at what your neighbors are doing, you can do that, but you can also do almost any other thing you want to. Finally, one of the nice things about AGI is that in order to make it work, we're going to have to break the brittleness of the kind of bureaucratic machines that we build now, because the problems with bureaucracies and the problems with current symbolic AIs are roughly the same kinds of problems. So I claim that when we get AGI, it will be because we've managed to get beyond this kind of brittleness, which means that chances are we'll be able to at least possibly build our social and political structures a little more competently as well. And finally, this is just a case of cluelessness is its own poor reward. Whereas if companies, not to mention governments, were run by AGIs, they would do a better job simply because they were smarter. Okay. Don't hold your breath, but it's conceivable.
All right, Dr. Hugo de Garis, explaining what we're all doing.
So Josh took the optimistic view. I take the pessimistic view. I live in a country where just a few decades ago about 70 million people were killed by the greatest tyrant in history. I'm talking about Mao Zedong, killed more than Stalin or Hitler. So the Chinese have a living memory of great horror. The Europeans, the older Europeans, went through the Second World War and bombed, and the Blitz and Belsen and the city that got bombed flat by Churchill. Dresden, yeah, okay. Americans, you're fortunate. You haven't really had a major catastrophe since the Civil War, and even that was fairly small scale, like 500,000 or so killed and confined to half a dozen states. So I do notice, because I've lived in 7 countries, I sense a correlation between New World cultures and a greater level of optimism, and Old World cultures and a greater level of acceptance of negative scenarios. I give this talk in various countries. Well, maybe I'm just kidding myself, but that's what I suspect. Okay, so my claim in the debate is that the rise of the massively intelligent machine, I call them artilects, that's artificial intellect, I'm calling them that since the 80s, will be actually catastrophic for human beings in the long term. And by long term I mean sort of late 21st century, so we're at the beginning of the century, so we still have a lot of time. Leading to a major war, and the most passionate war that we've ever had, ever. And if you extrapolate up the graph of number of people killed in major wars, the prediction is that it won't be in the millions, it'll be in the billions. So it really is a negative scenario. I hope I'm wrong, obviously, but well, we'll see. Okay. Now, if you believe that artilects can be programmed or designed, built, so that they remain friendly to us, even as they become hugely more intelligent than us, then there's no debate. I mean, all my scenario becomes moot, right? So I better clear that away. I'm very cynical of the idea that you can make machines of increasing intelligence above us friendly to us. My great fear is that once they become so superior to us, they may just look on us as ants. It's just irrelevant. And maybe as a pest. And maybe as consciously they wipe us out, or indirectly they do something not caring about us because we're so insignificant. And as a side effect, we just get wiped out. So, there's a lot of risk. It seems to me the key word is risk. So just quickly, a few arguments why I feel that human unfriendly AI is possible. One's sort of intuitive. If you're smarter than the human programmer who put the 3 laws, if you like, Asimov type programming into you, if you're smarter than that, what's to stop you just sort of looking at this human level programming and saying, God, how stupid. Other arguments? Maybe reaching human level intelligence, perhaps, and just a maybe, perhaps the only way to do that is to use an evolutionary engineering approach, the way I do. How does a being of a finite intelligence X create a being smarter than it? Well, we do it all the time with our children, in a sense. And we do that by sort of rearranging the chromosomes. So maybe evolutionary engineering is the only way. But if you do that, it's incredibly complex. How do you understand it when you don't? It's too complex to be understood. But it functions anyway. If we'll have full-blown nanotechnology in the next few decades. And so you put a lot of programming in a very small space, and along comes a cosmic ray. So even if hypothetically you could create an ethical Artilect, and you had zillions of them, what's to stop just one stray, what's the word, aberrant, jet lag's getting to cosmic raid machine that then behaves like a maverick. Okay. You're just being plain wrong. You feel you've made it ethical, but you're just wrong for some reason or another. Like, my background is mathematical physics. In the 30s, John von Neumann so-called proved hidden variable theories are impossible. And then in the 60s, along comes Bell and says von Neumann was wrong. So there's always the oops factor. And even if you could, if a lot of people felt they really could create justifiably, provably ethical creatures, the politicians won't trust them. So you still have a problem. So the politicians typically would take that view. Okay, this most of you probably know already. Presented a little bit last year. These are all the things that I think are coming that will make 21st century Artilects possible. So Moore's law is predicting by about 2020 putting one bit on one atom. So then what do we do? Femtotech? Quark engineering, or elementary particle engineering, or nuclear engineering? So if you're putting one bit on one atom, it'll be switching in femtoseconds. That's 10 to the 15 times a second. Quantum computing is reversible, so no heat generated, so you can have three-dimensional circuits of any size. Nanotech, perhaps we can grow three-dimensional objects from one-dimensional instructions, a la DNA, and have a kind of artificial embryology. We grow our artificial brains that way. Evolutionary sort of stuff I do, build things by evolving them. I teach something called topological quantum computing. It's the basic idea is you take a quantum computer, you take the quantum bits and you put them in topological quantum fields. So the topological nature of that field makes that information robust, so it doesn't get lost, doesn't get disturbed by local disturbances.
You got 3 more minutes.
Oh my god, okay.
You've been very keep on.
Yeah, I'm going to go fast. Right. Anyway, so Artilects will be quantum computers. Explosion in neuroscience, we'll have artificial brains, huge industries. Machines are potentially hugely more, trillions of times. So human brain about 10 to the 16 bits a second, but these nanotech, 1 bit per atom, quantum computers, whatever, hugely above us. So an Artilect's potentially vastly superior to what we are. So then the species dominance debate starts. If everyone has their home robot, and every year or two they change the model and upgrade it. So people will be asking questions like this. Could they become smarter? Should there be an upper limit on their intelligence? Can the rise be stopped? How would we as human beings feel if we became number 2? And should we build these godlike creatures? So I see humanity splitting 3 major philosophical groups: the people who want to build them, the people who are against building them, and the people who want to become them themselves. They're the various names. Okay? And each group has a series of philosophical, political arguments. Cosmists, well, the big picture, the universe, right? We die out in 80 years, but these creatures will be immortal. It'd be almost like a religion. The sense of awe and destiny and energy. So you'd be building gods. How do you stop? I mean, how could it be stopped? It's in our genes, in our nature to strive and push and so forth. The economic momentum would be huge. We're talking trillions of dollars. And the military momentum. In the time frame we're talking about, if China doesn't change its government fairly soon, then economic, military rivalry between the US and China is worrying. Now the Terrans, they're the people who are opposed to building them. Basically, their motive is fear. A key word in the species dominance debate is risk. So how could you be sure that these creatures one day may decide just to wipe us out? Whatever. So fear of difference when the guy next to you is a cyborg and sort of learn French in a minute. So one problem I have with Ray Kurzweil, I just feel he doesn't take sufficiently into account the irrational negative side of human nature. He's just too optimistic. So you don't discount this kind of thing. To a Terran, a cyborg, and an Artilect are not very different. There's so much computing capacity, say, in a grain of sand. So if you add just like one grain to a human brain, then effectively that human is no longer human. So
one more minute to explain why Doom is enough.
Okay, so the cyborgs, their argument is become gods themselves, and maybe you can avoid the clash between the groups who want to build and not build it. But I think that the cyborgs, they'll argue, if everybody at the same pace converts from being human to cyborg, maybe it will work, but obviously that's highly unrealistic. I mean, imagine a mother adds a grain of sand to her baby, newly born baby, and then suddenly the baby's no longer human, right? So in a sense, she's killed the baby. Or imagine that you're, going to say, your 60s and your adult children decide that they will go cyborg, and they're no longer human. So you've lost your children. So you know, there's all kinds of emotional baggage.
You got to wrap up, though.
Okay. All kinds of cultural alienations. Everyone's changing, and there's nothing assured, and it's all new. There's enormous scope here for Murphy's law to react. This is not just hypotheses anymore. Kurzweil and I, there was a BBC Horizon program 2.5 years ago where people actually voted that they prefer the Kurzweil optimistic view or my very pessimistic, and here were the results. Roughly a third thought a war would come, and about 2/3 Kurzweil. Oh, given the time. How might a war heat up?
Your time is up.
If you can read it quickly.
Time for Josh to rebut.
Okay. Well,
and you get a chance to rebut him.
All right. So I see that as the question which will dominate our global politics this century, and some references.
Okay, it seems to me that what Hugo is trying to say is that there are going to be people who are so scared of the AIs because they believe things like the movies of Terminator, that they're going to go to war with the people who want to build them. And this just strikes me as not being the sort of motivation for major world wars that I've ever seen before. I think the sort of thing that you're going to see much, much more likely is that we have all our people in the Department of Defense building AIs and artificially intelligent weapon systems, and they're going to be our AIs. And then the guys in China are going to build their artificially intelligent weapon systems, and they're going to be their AIs. And if there is a war, it's just going to be the same kind of war we ever had before, and it might be a worse war or not, depending on the specific exigencies of the technology. But there's certainly not going to be a war between people who are AI proponents and people who are anti-AI. I mean, there are much, much stronger emotions aroused on questions like abortion that we haven't had any major wars over, or at least since the religious wars in Europe in the medieval period. So I think that the notion that this sort of thing that this really small group of hyper nerds are super interested in is going to massively inflame the population of the world to get into a giga-death war, it is a little far-fetched. And I think that the probability that we actually do bring some of the AI software capability of building artificial systems that are less clueless, more responsive, and more robust to unexpected changes in its operating parameters is likely to give us better governments, and hopefully ones that aren't going to commit the same sort of genocides on their own people that we saw so much of during the 20th century. As a matter of fact, right after the previous phase change, we had the Industrial Revolution. There was the 1 century out of the 5 centuries between 1500 and 2000. The 1 century that was relatively much more peaceful than the other ones was in fact because of the Industrial Revolution. It was called the Pax Britannica, and it was because the British Empire essentially had a hegemony over the world and essentially enforced a peace, essentially out of a sense of enlightened self-interest, because they knew they'd be better off with protected sea lanes and worldwide commerce. And I think that to the extent that AIs are really that much smarter than people and they really get in charge, they're going to do the same sort of thing because war is just bad for business.
This is my second book, and it's much more optimistic than the first one. Basically, it's saying, if you look at the rate that countries in the world are democratizing, it's roughly about 2 per year, then you can predict, and it's almost a straight line. Like the vertical axis is the percentage of countries still remaining that are dictatorships versus time. It's almost coming down almost like in a straight line. So you can predict that in about 40 years there won't be any more dictatorships.
Because we'll all be dead.
I know. I mean,
They'll go democratic.
I'm actually in quite strong agreement with your, what I call middle term. So in 40 years' time, virtually no dictatorships left. So I coined the word de-dictation, meaning getting rid of dictatorships. Another generalization from political science is that democracies do not go to war with each other. So hopefully 40 odd years, we'll live in a democratic world, and I'm hoping for the creation of a global state. So in a sense, this comes first, and then this. This is later in the century, well into the second half, probably. So with all this optimism and living with great wealth, a la Bill Gates, all of us, what I find missing in your analysis is the fear factor. I mean, imagine your children, grandchildren, having their home robots and upgrading every 2 or 3 years, and they just see, millions, if not billions of people will see for themselves the gap, human IQ level gap, and the machine intelligence, that gap closing. And of course, everybody will be asking those kinds of questions. So I imagine a great debate raging. In fact, we'll probably get going amongst the populace in a few months. Have you heard that the Ray Kurzweil movie is coming out? Transcendent Man? So I wouldn't be at all surprised, that will help stimulate the debate. So don't underestimate the fear factor, the fear of difference. Just the slight change the color of your hair or the angle of your eyes. When I was in Japan, I lived 8 years in Japan, I'd sit down and I could just sense the hatred of these older Japanese. Why? Because my ancestors firebombed them. Right? So they're just minor differences. So, I mean, how are we going to feel when these creatures, these cyborgs, if you like, part human, part something else? Well, I don't have to defend this as a hypothesis, right? The sociologists have already, in a sense, started. Well, you saw the third, 2/3. I invite my audiences when I talk to vote, and it's 60-40.
One more minute.
Okay, it's 60-40, 40-60, 50-50. Seems to be an issue that splits people right down the line. And in fact, I suspect it's within the individual, because the cosmic picture is magnificent, right? You'd be building gods. But on the other hand, maybe our potential exterminators. It's a really deep issue. So you have two ideologies, very powerful, each in its own right, bitterly opposed, and hence a major war. We've always had wars. So with late 21st century weaponry, maybe nano-based,